Cornell University. My name is Nicholas Phillips, and thank you so much for joining us today for our conversation. Today we're talking about reducing bias in hiring. And I know this is a major topic, and we can go in a bunch of different directions, but we're going to talk about kind of the initial part of the hiring process. So, from submitting applications to ultimately the interview process. Now, before we get started, just a couple of quick housekeeping notes. We want our conversation to be as interactive as possible. So go ahead and submit your questions via the chat. You can open up that chat dialog box by submitting your questions in the top right corner of the player. Also, we'll be asking you some questions as well. So go ahead and scan the QR code with your phone. We'll be getting in your responses, and you can kind of submit your responses there. So to our first question, we want to know, what industry do you work in? What do you do for a living? So again, you can scan this QR code with your phone, and we'll get some of your responses right here on this screen. And as we wait for your responses, it's my pleasure to welcome in Devon Proudfoot. Devon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's great to be here.
It's so great to have you. Devon works in the ILR school, and she also is one of our faculty authors of one of our certificate programs, where you can find right there in the viewer chat as well. We'll make sure to submit that URL link in there. And we're waiting on some responses. So before we get started, Devon, I really want to kind of baseline our conversation today. So, hiring and bias is obviously a major topic, and is, we can go in a bunch of different directions. But how should we think about, bias and things like that when we're talking about hiring?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when I think about bias, oftentimes what I like to think about is something a little bit more specific, which is cognitive bias. Mm-hmm. And when we think about cognitive bias, what we're really talking about is the tendency of the human mind to sometimes sort of jump to conclusions or make errors when we're forming opinions about other people, right? And so this is just sort of something that we all experience, right? We're sometimes tired, we're sometimes rushed, we sometimes don't really have a lot of energy to really, do our due diligence and really gather all the information that we should about someone else. And so we sort of take shortcuts. We rely on heuristics and assumptions, and this leads importantly to error, right? And this is a problem, right? And this is really what I like to think about when I think about bias and how we evaluate others, and specifically how we evaluate others in the hiring process.
And where do some of these biases kind of stem from?
That's another great question. So I think a good way to think about bias is that, people are well-intentioned. I don't think most of us intend to judge others in a biased way. However, we all live in the social world, and we're all exposed to lots of ideas from the time that we're, little kids, right? So we watch things on TV, we see certain things in movies, we see things in the news, our parents might tell us certain things, and all of these sorts of representations, for instance, of different social groups, of different types of people, they sort of seep into our subconscious, and they can sort of influence the conclusions we jump to, right? And the assumptions we might have, right? So even if we don't intend to have bias, and we might not even be aware that we have certain assumptions, or even really consciously believe in those assumptions, they can still sort of sit in our unconscious. They can sort of be there outside of our awareness because of just all the stuff we're exposed to in our social world.
And kind of how do we bring some of these biases from maybe our unconscious mind to our conscious mind and understand, like, hey, this is maybe a bias that I have?
That is another really important question. So I think you've touched on something important, which is that there's a difference between conscious bias and unconscious bias, right? So conscious bias is really what we're aware of, right? So if we know that we prefer, one type of ice cream over another, that might be sort of a bias in favor of a certain flavor. But oftentimes we have these sort of preferences or maybe opinions or beliefs that we really aren't aware of, right? They're sort of latent, and we aren't really aware of them. And if we did know about them, we'd be sort of shocked and maybe appalled that we have these assumptions or associations. And so going back to your question, I think that oftentimes it is sort of difficult to uncover these unconscious biases, right? And so acknowledging that and acknowledging that there might be stuff happening outside of our conscious awareness that's influencing how we make judgments is sort of the first step in sort of figuring out, okay, I'm not perfect and I might not be aware of stuff that's influencing me. So how can I create a process that sort of helps me make more objective decisions, that doesn't rely on me to necessarily be aware of everything that's influencing me, rather than trying to sort of bring all these things to my conscious awareness, which research I think shows can often be very difficult for people to do, mainly because we are well-intentioned and we don't want to have these biases, right? So instead of, trying to make the unconscious conscious, I think a better strategy is to sort of acknowledge we're imperfect and just try to set up a strategy that's going to help us avoid being biased or being influenced by unconscious bias in hiring.
Perfect. So one thing for the audience, remember, you're not perfect.
Yeah.
And
Indeed.
with that, I want to turn to our audience now. So it looks like we have folks from all across the map. We have government representing healthcare, a little bit all over the place, HR, perfect, higher ed, IT, all over the place. So when we initially had spoken about, doing this conversation, we had talked about, the 3 different phases of the hiring process. Is there one area in the hiring process that's influenced more or affected more by bias?
Interesting question. So I think my first answer is that bias can really show up in any phase or aspect of the hiring process where you have an evaluator who's engaging with a job candidate or a potential job candidate, right? So the more obvious points in the hiring process that we think about bias creeping in is, resume evaluation or the interview process. But we can also think of potential bias in how recruiters interact with potential job candidates, for instance, at job fairs, right? So if recruiters are sort of implicitly, feeling more comfortable around certain potential candidates than others, or they have assumptions about who might want to work at their organization over others, this can also sort of influence, in a biased way, how they are engaging with people, right? So I think that my first answer is it can show up anywhere, but we also have to think about the less obvious ways in which it can show up. And I think also research suggests that the less we know about someone, so when we're first getting to know someone, that's actually when bias is most likely to influence our impression of that person. So when we get to know people better, when we gather more data about them, we get to know them as individuals, that's when we see in studies bias start to go away, right? Because I'm, getting to know you as a human, right? I'm learning all about you and getting an accurate impression of you, right? So if we apply that knowledge to the hiring process, what we can think about is when we have less information about a job candidate, when the first glance of the resume, right? The first handshake when they come in for the interview, these are when we jump to conclusions, or we're more likely to be susceptible to jumping to conclusions, right? And that's when bias can creep in. Once we've had several interactions with a person, we might get to know them more, and that's when bias is less likely to influence us. So those are my 2 answers.
Okay. So would it benefit organizations to maybe extend their hiring process, maybe just an extra couple weeks to kind of better get to know their candidates a little bit?
So I think that is definitely an interesting solution. I think that perhaps that's less efficient than most organizations want to be, because normally organizations want to make decisions relatively quickly and efficiently. But I think that what's more important is just to try to look at the person or the candidate in front of you and try to gather as much data as you can about that person in front of you, to try to make an accurate assessment of them, and sort of know that the initial assumption you're making about them when you first meet them might not be true, and that you want to sort of confirm any assumptions that you have through data gathering.
And, are there, generally, are there assumptions that, maybe people make initially that the research says, well, maybe that assumption is wrong, or maybe we need to think about that differently?
Right. Yeah. So I think that goes back to the discussion of bias, right? So we talked about bias as sort of these errors or heuristics or assumptions that we make about people. And in the hiring process, one important type of bias is stereotyping, right? Where we're making an assumption about an individual based on the social group that individual is a member of, right? And the problem there is that there's a lot of variability within social groups, right? So I like to use the example of I'm Canadian, right? And there's a stereotype of Canadians that we're all really polite. But I can tell you from experience that while some Canadians are super polite, others are really not that polite, right? And so the idea is that there is variability, right? People are idiosyncratic, right? And so if we make an assumption about someone based on their social category, their social group membership, we're very often going to be wrong, right? We're going to be off from the truth. And this is a problem, right? Because we want to make accurate, fair, objective decisions about who we hire. And so we don't want to be influenced by stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. And how do we kind of break that mold of, us having some of these biases and understanding like, hey, this is the type of bias that I have, or this is the type of bias that somebody else might have? How do we kind of break that mold, I guess, in our consciousness?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that there's a couple of different answers. So one thing I like to talk about is that there's a difference between stereotypes and discrimination. Right? Mm-hmm. So stereotypes are beliefs, right? They're assumptions we hold. They're conclusions that we jump to about people based on their background, their social group. Beliefs, though, are different than actions, right? So when we think about discrimination, these are the actual decisions that we make in the hiring process, right? Who to shortlist, who to bring in for an interview, who to give an offer to. And so what we want to do is make sure that these beliefs, these stereotypes, even though we might hold them and they might be unconscious and difficult to get rid of, that they don't actually influence the actions we take, the decisions we make about who to hire, right? And so interrupting that connection, I think, is a really important thing to think about, right? And so organizations, what they want to do is they want to put processes in place that lead us to slow down, right? Deliberate, make sure that we're not making those assumptions, so that even though they might come to mind, stereotypes might be salient in a moment, we say, okay, that's probably an assumption I'm making. Let me gather more data so that it doesn't influence my decision making, and I'm not influenced by bias in who I decide to actually shortlist or hire.
Perfect. And I want to turn to our audience really, really quickly. So we just have our second audience question that we want to ask you. So we've had a great conversation talking about bias. So my question for our audience, our second question is, what comes to mind for you when you think of bias? And again, you can scan the QR code right here on your screen and kind of submit your responses, and we'll get kind of some of your responses here. So I recently saw that Chick-fil-A hired a VP of DEI and are kind of getting some pushback about it. That was last week. Is this where we really need to start thinking about kind of breaking that mold of biased hiring? Really kind of, does it start at the top? Does it start with the person doing the initial search? Kind of where does that start?
Yeah, so I think research shows that in order for DEI strategies to be effective in an organization, and specifically strategies related to reducing bias in hiring, we really need buy-in from all levels within the organization, right? So we can't just have senior leadership buy-in or the buy-in from people on the ground making decisions. We really need everyone to sort of understand the why of this, right? And I think often there's a lack of communication about the why, right? So organizations are not effectively communicating why they're investing resources in strategies to reduce bias in hiring. And I think that there's two reasons why, right? One is fairness. We want to be fair to applicants. We want to treat everyone in a just way. But we also want to make accurate decisions about who to hire, right? It's in the organization's interest to hire the best person from the job. And if we're making a bunch of errors and, not really making objective decisions, we're not actually hiring the best people for our company, right? And so we want to both think about fairness and accuracy as two whys, and get everyone on board in the organization through an explanation of the why.
And how do we get everybody kind of on the same page from, senior leadership to, maybe somebody on a lower level? How do we bridge that gap in communication?
Yeah, I think that's an important question, and I'm not sure one that can be sort of equally applied across. Each organization is going to have a different strategy, right, based on the context that they're in. But I do think that having discussions about what we're trying to achieve in our hiring and all the benefits that can come with making more accurate, fair decisions, and sort of talking about how oftentimes we have good intentions, but the human mind is limited, and we want to help ourselves make more accurate forecasts of who's going to be the best person for the job, and sort of getting people on board with that, I think can help get different levels of people on board, and also connecting it to the broader organizational strategy as well.
Awesome. And I want to thank all our viewers for submitting your responses here. So it looks like we kind of all over the map again. So it looks like what comes to mind when people think of bias, discrimination is obviously a huge one. Is this a surprise for you, Devon, that a lot of people think of discrimination when they think of bias in hiring?
No, not at all. Because I think that oftentimes bias leads to discrimination, right? And that's why it's such a problem and one that we really need to address, right? So totally makes sense to me. And I'm glad that people are seeing the connection there.
Yeah, it looks like they're really all over the map here, which is great. I love that. So my next question is, what type of bias is really most prevalent in the hiring process?
Oh, that is a great question. I'm not actually totally sure that I have like a number one bias in hiring across all organizations. But I will talk about something that is pretty prevalent, which is affinity bias or homophily effects. So what this bias involves is a tendency for humans, evaluators, decision makers, hiring managers to like people who are similar to themselves, right? Okay. So this is something that's natural, right? We see someone who's similar to ourselves and we're like, oh, that person's cool. I like them. They make me comfortable. They remind me of myself, right? That's natural and we all do it. But it becomes problematic in hiring because if everyone doing the decision making is of a certain demographic group and they are, thinking about hiring in this homophily type way, right? Is this person similar to me? That's going to lead them to choose people similar to them to enter into the organization, right? And that really limits diversity. And so I think homophily effects and affinity bias are prevalent, prominent, often in the hiring process, and something that we want to think about, right? Because even though we might like someone and we think, oh, they could be my friend here and I feel comfortable and they seem cool, like, are they really the best person for the job? And are they going to help us, bring a new perspective, diversify, et cetera, assuming those are the goals that our organization has.
And do you find that people are aware of affinity bias when they're thinking about, the hiring process?
Yeah, I don't know if people are really thinking about that. I think that oftentimes we hear, people want someone who's going to, fit well in the organization, right? And this is really very closely related to affinity bias, right? It's essentially saying, is this person similar to other people who've done well in this organization? Are they going to fit? And I think this is really something we want to think closely about if we're really trying to diversify and include more perspectives in the workplace, is that we really want to question whether fit is really what we're going for here, or we maybe want difference, or we want broadening of perspective, et cetera. So to answer your question, I'm not actually sure people are that aware of it because I'm always hearing about, cultural fit as a criteria for hiring.
And, what does the research tell us about kind of the benefits of understanding that, there is bias in the hiring process and we can fix it? What are some of the benefits of that?
Yeah, so I think that I've talked about a few of them, right? So we want to, essentially, in hiring, what we're trying to do is forecast future performance, right? We're assessing a bunch of candidates and we're saying, okay, who here is going to do well at the company, right? It's a forecasting task. Right? And in order to accurately forecast, we can't be prone to all these errors and jump to conclusions and make suboptimal decisions, right? We need to sort of think deliberatively and try to actually make a good decision, an accurate decision to help us accurately forecast. So accuracy, I think, is one thing that we want to think about. Another reason we want to engage in bias reduction strategies in hiring is because it impacts the candidate's experience of the process, right? So I think oftentimes organizations aren't thinking about the fact that, if a bunch of candidates are coming through the interview process and they have a really negative experience, an experience that's not inclusive, seems to be biased, that's going to influence them as they enter the organization, right? That's really going to shape the way they think about that company, the people they're going to work with. And if it's a really inclusive process, they're going to really come in with a positive expectation and feel included and good about the company. If they had a bad experience, they're going to say, I can't wait to get out of here in 6 months because that was kind of terrible and I'm not really feeling great, right? So we can think about, bias reduction as having all these benefits, I think, to organizations. And also it helps us diversify our workforce, which is often a goal that many organizations have.
And do you find that organizations take that step back and, maybe ask their employees or maybe people on the hiring committee, hey, how'd this process go, or how did you like that process?
Totally, yeah. So I think organizations are increasingly gathering data from both job candidates and employees about what they are experiencing and how they experience, for instance, the hiring process, right? So they can improve it. They can make sure that they're, engaging in best practices. I think companies are increasingly trying really hard to make their hiring processes fairer, more inclusive, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like more and more organizations are kind of starting to utilize AI in their hiring process. I know this is kind of a little off topic, but I promise I'll get to my question. But does the use of AI, does that kind of help us kind of get rid of the idea of bias in hiring?
That is a complicated question. So I think that we want to think about AI as a tool that can potentially be helpful in reducing bias in hiring, but can also actually perpetuate bias in hiring, right? And so what we're seeing is that even though AI or algorithms have the potential to reduce bias in hiring because they're very consistent and they don't have the same sort of limitations that the human mind does, right? They're going to apply the same criteria to every single candidate, regardless of preferences or homophily or anything. They're always going to make the same exact decision, weigh the different criteria the exact same way. So in that way, AI are useful and can reduce some of these biases we've talked about that humans might be prone to. However, if humans are programming AI, what we've seen is that the same bias that's in the human mind unconsciously can also end up within the algorithms that we create, right? And we might think, oh, now the algorithm's in charge and it'll be fine. And just like the algorithm will make this decision and it'll be unbiased. But what we've seen in research is that oftentimes the algorithms, because they're programmed by humans, can actually start making biased decisions consistent with what a human would do. So we need to have a lot of oversight over AI, I think. And think of it as a tool that can help us reduce bias, but isn't necessarily going to do so unless we program AI to make objective, accurate decisions.
I have a great follow-up for you, and Rachel actually just submitted a question. So Rachel, I promise I'll get to your question. But so should we think about using AI kind of in partnership or as kind of an assistant and not necessarily kind of the main drawer?
Totally. So I think definitely we want to have a partnership or oversight over any sort of AI tool that we're incorporating into the hiring process for sure. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for your question. So Rachel asks, are employee referral programs a primary source of affinity bias? Are they going away?
Can you repeat the first part of the question?
Yes. So Rachel asks, are employee referral programs a primary source of affinity bias? Should they or are they going away?
Rachel, that is an excellent question because I really wanted to talk about referrals, and I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to do so. So, yes, referrals are something that definitely can be subject to affinity bias, right? So what are referrals? They're where, you ask your employees, oh, do you know anyone? Do you have any friends or family who might want to work at the company? Like, tell them to come and apply, right? Seems like a great way to get some great new employees, but you're going to get people thinking of people who are very similar to themselves, right? They might even be related to that person, right? So if we have a goal of diversifying, referrals have been shown to maybe not be the best way to engage in hiring. However, there has been some research, some case studies showing that you can actually use referrals to diversify. If you ask people to specifically think of people who are dissimilar to them or from different backgrounds in who they've chosen to refer, right? So instead of just being like, who's the first person who comes to mind, or who's your best friend, or, does someone in your family want to work here? We can say, we're really trying to increase diversity, perhaps give a few dimensions. Do you know anyone who would sort of help us achieve that goal, who would also be a good fit for this role? And if you give employees those kinds of criteria, what we find is referrals are actually quite good at helping companies reach diversity goals. But if you just say, first person who comes to mind, friend or family, then we see the opposite effect, right? So that's my answer.
Okay, so have some ideas when we're asking people like, who would be a good person for this fit.
Exactly, yeah.
Perfect. And Francisco actually just checks in with another question. So Francisco asks, how might organizational culture influence bias?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think that really brings us to the question of inclusion in organizations, right? And having a culture in which these issues are talked about, right? So I think that oftentimes we can think of companies as sort of on a spectrum, right? So some organizations, they don't want to talk about diversity and inclusion issues, right? They're like, that's awkward. We don't want to talk about it. We want everyone to be happy, but like, we don't want to talk about it. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there are companies that are like, this is an issue and we got to talk about potential biases and we got to talk about our assumptions, right? Who we think is the best for different roles and assignments and things like that. And we have to question those assumptions, right? And I think that in cultures like the latter, we see a lot more sort of interruption of bias, right? And having employees really think hard about, what are their assumptions? Are they jumping to conclusions, et cetera? If we shove everything under the rug and we don't really talk about it, and we pretend that it doesn't exist, even though we know from decades of research that there's bias, unconscious bias, then we have a culture where it's never going to be addressed, right, and never reduced and never questioned. So I totally think that culture is really important in reducing bias.
Awesome. Francisco, thank you for that question. And one that just kind of came to mind was, are there certain, not necessarily organizations, but industries that lend themselves to, being biased in their hiring practice?
That's a good question. I honestly think that, bias could exist anywhere, right? I don't think it's specific to any particular industry. And I think that it goes back to the idea that the human mind is limited, right? And we're all humans, right? And so if we're in, no matter what industry we're in, we're all susceptible to assumptions. And I think that what really is varying is to what extent companies within a particular industry are willing to take steps to reduce that bias, right? But I think, it's not like in some industries, there's just like, they're bias free, we're all in a utopia. And then other industries, it's a big problem. I think, all industries need to care about this because it's an issue that would affect them all.
And I'm trying to think the best way to phrase this. Does it happen when, say maybe a major employer in a certain industry decides to focus on, being unbiased in their hiring process? Can that affect an entire industry? So can another organization or a competing organization say, well, this is what this company's doing, maybe we should think about bias in our hiring? Does that ever happen? Oh,
totally. I see that all the time, right? So I think that companies are really trying to share information on this and engage in best practices. I see a lot of information sharing all the time between HR practitioners, trying to find ways to make the interview process more equitable, more inclusive, different strategies. They're always sharing information, I think, because, they care. They want to be better. And I think they're really trying to do so by sharing information.
Perfect. And one just got another audience question, and thank you so much for this, Heather. So Heather really, really quickly asks, can those diversity-based employee referrals lead to tokenization?
For sure. And I think that's really important that you bring up tokenization. So in general, we want to avoid, just to talk about what tokenization is to have any person from a marginalized background come into your company and feel like, first of all, they're the only person from that background at your organization. It's a very negative experience. And you also don't want to make them feel like they've only been hired because of some goal to diversify, right? So you want to be really careful to avoid tokenization. And to make sure that you're, really not just bringing in one person who's from a marginalized background, but really trying to really diversify, right? Really bring in lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds to avoid these harmful feelings of tokenization.
Perfect. And Heather, thank you so much for that question. So what are some things that, organizations can do to, maybe practices to put in place to say, okay, here's how we can change our hiring practices? What are some things they should think about first?
That's a great question. So there are lots of tips. I won't have time to get into all of them right now, but I'll try to tell you about a few quick ones. So I think that oftentimes when we think about hiring, we think about resumes, right? We all get these resumes coming in, right? And we have a lot of data. We have a lot of information. There's so much information in resumes. It can be overwhelming. So one thing I like to tell evaluators is that we want to make an information relevance plan before we look at anyone's resume. right? We want to think about what are we trying to actually learn about this person from the resume, and we want to make a list that we're going to focus on, right? Is it credentials? Is it education? Is it years of work experience? And then when we actually evaluate resumes, we want to stay focused on that information, right? We don't want to get distracted by all the person's other experiences, their hobbies, etc. We want to stick with the a priori plan that we have, right? And this can be really effective at reducing biased evaluation of resumes. The other thing we want to think about when it comes to interviews, which is another important part of the hiring process, is making those interviews as structured as possible, right? So what we want to avoid is going into the interview and just making it an informal chat, right? Get to know you chat, oh, how was your weekend, etc. That's like the worst thing we can do if we're trying to reduce bias, because what it does is it guides each interview with each candidate in a different direction, right? So we're not really comparing apples to oranges. So instead we want to make interviews structured, which merely means you make a set of questions in advance, scoring criteria in advance, and you apply that exact set of questions and exact scoring criteria to each candidate in the exact same way, right? And this really allows us to, or forces us to really evaluate everyone consistently and objectively, right? Homophily or affinity bias can't come into play then if we're really focused on that. So I think those are two quick strategies, at least, to reduce bias to some extent in hiring.
Very, very quick. And I guess, should we focus on maybe one more than the other? So should we focus on maybe, having those set of questions for each person that we interview, or having an idea of, okay, this is what we're looking for in resumes? Where should we kind of start?
That's an interesting question. So I think it's really specific to the organization in question, right? So you want to think about, I think first you want to think about, where do we see bias, right? Are we seeing bias at the resume evaluation stage? Are we seeing bias at the interview stage? Where are we seeing certain candidates drop out from certain groups, right? And then we want to tailor our intervention to that stage of the hiring process, right? So if we're seeing a lot of diversity in our candidates all the way up to the interview process, and then the interviews happen and we get the scores back and all of a sudden diversity drops in terms of the candidates moving to the next phase, we got a problem in the interview process, right? We want to focus resources on reducing bias in the interview process, maybe training interviewers more, or implementing a structured interview process, right? So we want to collect data, I think, to understand within an organization where we might be having some issues, and then apply the intervention based on what the data tell us.
And how should an organization go about maybe looking at their interview process and saying, like, okay, this is where we might see some bias, or this is where we might see some bias?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? So I think it goes back to what I was just talking about a little bit, which is that we want to think about the idea that we're starting out with a pool of candidates, right? We have a bunch of people who apply to our job, and then they have to go through a filtering system with various stages, right? And at each stage, certain people are, making it to the next phase and certain people are not, right? And we want to collect data at each phase to see who's moving and whether that varies by demographic group, for instance, right? So data collection is super important, and it will really help us sort of hone in on where stuff's going wrong, right? Where we're losing diversity in that applicant pool, which will help us make some fixes.
And SK actually checks in with a really great question. So SK asks, can you talk about strategies that can help orgs kind of research talent from marginalized groups? So maybe kind of getting a little bit deeper in there as far as, marginalized groups go.
Yeah, totally. I really appreciate that question. So one thing we haven't really talked that much about is, like, how do you actually create a diverse talent pool, right? Like, how do you actually have a bunch of people from different backgrounds apply to your jobs, right? Because if you don't have any diversity in that pool, then it doesn't matter how amazing your resume evaluation process is or how unbiased your interview process is, you're not going to reach your diversity goals in your organization. So in terms of sourcing, which is what we talk about when we talk about the pool of people that we're trying to create who have applied to our jobs, there are lots of different strategies. So I think one thing that has been shown to be pretty effective is targeted recruiting. So going to, for instance, women's colleges or historically black colleges and recruiting specifically from those institutions has been shown to be quite effective. Diversifying who your recruiters are, right? So who are you actually sending out into the world to represent your company? Do those people represent the kinds of job candidates you're looking for, right? Those are all really important tactics that have been shown to be pretty effective in increasing applicants from different groups and backgrounds.
Perfect. So organizations should think about, not just getting in the resumes, but maybe their job descriptions and kind of who they send out as well?
Yes.
Perfect. And Heather actually just checks in with another great question. So Heather asks, are there any ethical or legal issues with asking for demographic information during the application process?
Yeah, great question, right? So I think that this is something that, my students often ask me about, right? Because, organizations want to collect data, right? If they're going to understand how they're doing in terms of diversity, they need data, but they also care about employees' privacy, right? And not everyone wants to disclose all their identities, right, to the company, right? They want to keep some things to themselves, right? They might have concerns about whether they'll be stigmatized based on their identities, right? So I think organizations need to really be careful and sort of balance this tension between wanting and needing to collect data in order to know whether they've met diversity goals and inclusion goals, but also respecting employees' wishes and perhaps making it optional, right? Or giving employees lots of information about how this information they provide will be used and won't be used, right? So issues around confidentiality, for instance, because I certainly think that is an important tension and an important issue for organizations to think about carefully.
And is there a right way to, approach that idea of trying to get that data, but also at the same time understanding that maybe, a potential employee might be uncomfortable with, submitting their ethnicity or religion or something like that? Is there kind of that fine line where, organizations can, say like, hey, we're just using this for data research or something like that? Yeah,
totally. I think that organizations just need to be really honest and also transparent about exactly why they're collecting the data to make people feel comfortable. But I also think that organizations need to just realize that some people just don't want to disclose everything about themselves at work, and that, that's okay, right? It's okay. We don't need to necessarily always bring our complete selves to work. And organizations just sort of need to, walk the line, I think, on that a little bit.
And Lori actually just checks in with a great question. So Lori asks, how do you feel about making resumes, quote, blind, i.e. taking out anything in the resume that indicates ethnicity or race?
Yeah, really great question, right? So I think that this idea of blinding or masking certain information in resumes can be a really great strategy for reducing bias in resume evaluation. So basically the idea here is that, when we see someone's name, that carries a lot of information, right? It can tell us their gender, their nationality, et cetera. And so if there are biases, unconscious biases you might have associated with that information, then simply not giving that information to people doing resume evaluation has been shown to be pretty effective at eliminating the influence of that information on resume evaluation, right? So I think that it definitely can be a useful strategy. But obviously we have to be in a situation where that's possible, right? So once we get to the interview phase, obviously masking or blinding no longer can help us. But certainly it's a strategy that's been, research shows has been quite effective. Yeah.
That's interesting. I've never thought about that before. And Tyranny actually just checks in with another great question. So Tyranny asks, do you have any tips on threading the needle between setting goals for diversity hiring and legal issues? So a lot to unpack there from Tyranny.
Yeah, so I think that a good way that I've heard HR practitioners think about it is it's really about opportunity, right? So getting your organization to the place where you're expanding who you're thinking about in terms of potential talent to really get the full potential out of all potential employees that could work at your organization, right? And so the idea here is that you really want to think about pulling people in, right? And giving people opportunities, right? It's not about exclusion or favoritism, but rather it's really about expanding the pie, right? And being open and inclusive. And I think that that's one way you can think about it.
And just as a quick follow-up, you had mentioned, the job description and everything like that and trying to kind of take out, biases in that. Are there certain words or phrases or anything like that can lend itself to, hiring and even the application process?
Yeah, there's been a lot of great research on this. So a lot of the research, what it looks at is when you have a job description, oftentimes this is put together and we don't really think twice about it, right? Seems good, seems inclusive, but what research shows is that often there's a lot of subtle wording in there that can really be impactful in turning members of certain historically marginalized groups off from applying from a job, right? So I think one of the things that has been shown is that, you want to avoid jargon, too much jargon, or insider lingo, acronyms in your job description, right? You want to keep it as inclusive and easy to understand to anyone as possible. You also want to avoid too much slang, so words that would only make sense to certain generational cohorts, for instance. You want to avoid that because it's really sending off signals, oh, this is the kind of person I'm looking for, or some people might be like, I don't know what that means, and they might not want to apply to your job. So if you're trying to, really have a diverse set of applicants applying, you want to avoid jargon and slang. There's also some really interesting research showing that you want to avoid hyperbolic terminology in your job descriptions, right? So this is sort of interesting research which shows that job descriptions that use words like superstar or exceptional performer, that women are actually turned off by these kinds of jobs or these job descriptions. And the idea here is that it's not that women don't think they have those qualities, they just don't think the organization is focused on growth opportunities, right? And so what this research finds is that using growth-related terminology, right? So things like, motivation to improve, for instance, has been much more effective at creating a more diverse set of candidates who are interested in your job.
So when, HR practitioners are thinking about crafting a, job description or anything like that, how should they approach trying to make it as inclusive as possible? Should they have somebody else look at it, or, maybe somebody from a different group, or, what's the process like for them to say, okay, I have this job description ready, but I want to make sure it's inclusive? How should they approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that ultimately organizations only have so much leeway, right? Because usually HR has a certain job description that they want. But what you can do, and I think that you really already mentioned it really, really well, is that you want to have multiple eyes on that job description. Because something that you might not notice, I might notice, or vice versa, right? So something that doesn't really flag anything for me, you might be like, no, get that out of there, right? And then I might see something and be like, let's not say this, let's say this other thing, right? So you want to have lots of eyes on the job description. And I think you want to just be mindful of the research that's out there about jargon, slang, hyperbolic terminology. There's also some research on gendered wording. So there's a lot of research showing that job descriptions that use overly masculine wording can really turn women off, and they don't want to apply to jobs that seem to have a lot of masculine wording. And the idea here is that they just think that the culture of the organization is going to be hyper masculine, and they're not really interested in working at that kind of company. And there's actually online free websites you can go to, and you just put your job description in, and it'll just tell you if you have overly masculine wording in your job description, and you can replace it with more gender neutral language too. So there's lots of tools out there. So I think, think about the research, use those tools, get lots of eyes on your job description within the limits that the HR will allow, to try to make it, as inclusive as possible. Because the idea is we want, as many people to be drawn in by this as possible, right? And we don't want to turn anyone off inadvertently.
And just very, very quickly, thank you all for your audience questions. I want to ask just one final question for our audience. So my question is, what's something you would recommend to your organization to maybe counteract bias in their hiring process? Again, you can kind of scan the QR code, and we'll kind of get some of your responses here. So one thing that I was thinking about, as far as, not just in the application process, but also in the hiring process, what steps can people take maybe during the interview process to maybe come off as more inclusive? So obviously now I feel like, doing more interviews virtually and things like that, are there certain backgrounds or certain things that people can, do as far as, having that interaction over an interview that they can do to come off as more inclusive?
Oh, that's a great question. When you say background, do you mean like your Zoom background?
Yes, a virtual background. As you can imagine, I've seen them all over the place.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And you never know what you're gonna give off via your background. So I'm not sure there's been any research on that. But yeah, so I think that there are lots of ways that you can send a signal to job applicants that you and your organization value inclusion, right? So really talking about that, right? All the ways that your organization really values inclusion and fairness in hiring. There's also a lot of research on nonverbals, right? Eye contact. smiling, paying attention, not going on your phone. These are all things that make people know that you care and that you're trying to be inclusive. In terms of Zoom, I do think that there's less opportunity for social connection and human connection on Zoom than in person. So it might be a little bit more difficult, honestly, to come off as inclusive on Zoom than in person. So you might want to really, try to go the extra mile in talking about the importance of inclusion at your organization if you're on Zoom, just because there's sort of that, the medium-based disconnect there.
Yeah, that screen can be cold sometimes.
Yes, very cold.
So would it be better to have maybe bringing people in and having that, kind of face-to-face interaction versus having that kind of cold medium screen in between?
Yeah, good question. So I think there's a lot of considerations to think about in this new post-pandemic world when we're thinking about virtual versus in-person interviews. So I think that while it might be useful to have people in person, right? It feels better to have an in-person interaction. I know that, you and I talked on Zoom and like being in person with you is great, right? I'm like, oh yeah, it's great to actually be here in a room with you. It feels good, but we want to think about, when we think about DEI, how making everyone come in can have some disparate impact on different groups of people, right? Mm-hmm. So if I'm someone who's immunocompromised, or maybe I'm a caregiver, I might have a reason why I want to do a virtual interview, right? And I don't want to come in, right? And so I think that's important to think about in terms of DEI goals. And I think also what you want to think about is consistency, right? You don't want to have some people coming in and some people interviewing on Zoom, right? Because some of the people are going to have more an advantage, right? Because they are in the in-person, more social situation than the Zoom people. And so you want to have consistency, right? Going back to the idea of structured interviews, you want to have the same plan for each candidate. So you want to sort of make an a priori decision, like, are we going to do all our interviews on Zoom or all in person? And I think that, if you're concerned that having them in person might marginalize certain candidates, you want to think about the Zoom option, I think. So lots of things to consider there.
Lots of things, for sure. And thank you, audience, for submitting your responses here. So it looks like training is actually the big one as far as, what is something you would recommend your organization do to counteract bias in hiring. How important is it to have those training models and making sure that, everybody on the hiring panel understands, like, okay, this is some of our best practices to counteract bias in our hiring?
Yeah, I think training is so important. And we want to think about training for lots of different people involved, right? So it's not just people who are doing interviews, it's also people evaluating resumes, it's recruiters, and it's also people making the final decisions, right? There's often lots of different eyes on candidates, and we want to make sure everyone's trained. We also want to make sure that we remind ourselves about these biases, right? We can have a training and then, we're tired, we're overwhelmed, we're overworked. We totally forget about that and we just do what we always did, right? So we want to have reminders as we go through the hiring process and check-ins where we're sort of calibrating with others and making sure that our decisions are consistent with the higher goals of the organization in terms of reducing bias.
And thank you all for submitting your responses. And actually, Becky just checks in with a great question. So Becky asks, what about unintended bias in the position announcement? Are there things the recruiter should be aware of or cautious of?
Yeah, totally. So I think that this sort of goes back to job descriptions, right? So we want to make sure that we're signaling that our organization is inclusive, right? And that we value diversity. Oftentimes organizations literally just say this in their job descriptions, right? This is totally normal, right? You just say that, we value diversity. We want applicants from all sorts of different backgrounds to apply. And we also want to make sure that we avoid those more subtle forms of wording that can turn certain candidates off. Another piece of research that I don't think I mentioned is that we can signal inclusion in our job descriptions by mentioning certain benefits that might be appealing to different marginalized groups, right? So, health benefits for domestic partners, different, benefits for caregivers, et cetera. Naming these in our job descriptions are pretty effective at signaling, like, we care about people from different groups and we want to include them and we have resources to help support them. Mm-hmm.
And thank you, Becky, for that question. And SK actually just checks in. So SK asks, structured interviews can help disrupt bias in hiring, but may impact neurodivergent populations who may have the talent to do the work, but may work differently when it comes to structure. How would you recommend organizations address this when it comes to folks who are neurodivergent?
That's a great question. I'm really glad that you brought up neurodivergent applicants. So I've seen organizations implement a few different programs to address this issue. So I think that one program that I saw that was quite effective had sort of a training module for neurodivergent applicants where they could, have sort of a pre-look at some of the questions and get comfortable with them, and sort of have a day where they went through the questions and sort of saw them in advance of the interview to sort of help them feel more comfortable, right, in the interview process. But I also think that, like, when it comes to incorporating that type of DEI concern into structured interviews, organizations really need to sort of think carefully about what their goals are, and it's not one size fits all. And I think companies are now really trying to out different programs to sort of be inclusive and make sure they're being inclusive. And that, I think that you're bringing up an interesting point, which is that we want to make sure that our bias reduction strategies are not going to actually exclude certain groups of people, right? And so thinking carefully about that, making accommodations, and so forth, I think is probably the best strategy.
And is this something organizations should think about when they're thinking about their, kind of hiring practices to try to be inclusive and think about, like, hey, maybe this type of wording specifically might, exclude this type of group? Or is that something, they should think about as far as, their hiring practices? Yeah,
so I think that, you can sort of think about job descriptions in isolation, right? We want to create the ideal job description that's super inclusive and doesn't exclude anyone. But you can also connect your job description to data that you have, right? So if you're like, we are having a really hard time recruiting women, what does the research say about how job descriptions can turn off women? And then make specific changes to your job description based on that research, right? So you can do something a little more nuanced than just sort of throwing it out at all the fixes and say, like, who's not clicking on this LinkedIn ad for our job, which is the group that we're losing, and what does the research say we can do to make our ad better, to make it more inclusive, to get more people excited from different groups.
And, what should organizations do to kind of maybe take a step back and say, okay, we understand that we're getting this amount of applicants, maybe we're excluding that group. How do organizations maybe start that conversation of saying, hey, maybe we need to kind of tweak this job description, or maybe kind of change our interview process? What's kind of the first step in that process of maybe reworking the hiring process?
Yeah. So I think that, in most organizations, hiring is constant. It's a cycle, right? There's always openings. There's usually jobs. People are being interviewed, et cetera. People are leaving. People are being promoted. So it's hard to really jump in, right? That's like the whole problem is that, people are busy, right? Companies have a lot going on, and so it's hard to know when to stop the wheel and make the change, right? But I think what's important, and I think I've said this a million times so far, is that we need to start collecting data, right? And if we have data on how diverse our workforce is, how diverse our applicant pool is, and if and where applicants are dropping off in the hiring process, collecting the data and looking at the data can be a first step that can really bring to light if there are issues going on, and then we can start thinking about how to address them, right? And oftentimes it takes a while to collect data, right? It depends on the size of your company, how many hires you're making. So if you implement the data collection now, you might need to wait a whole year or maybe even 2 or 3 years before you have enough data to really see any trends that are meaningful, right? So start collecting data is the first step, I would say.
And how important is it to have a diverse group of folks in the interview process? So maybe not just one individual from start to finish, but incorporating a bunch of different voices of diverse backgrounds.
Very important. So I think important for a bunch of different reasons. So I think that the first thing that comes to mind is just that in order to make objective, optimal hiring, you want to hear from more than one person and get more than one person's judgment, right? You don't want to have just one person in charge, right? Because maybe they're having a bad day, right? You want to have lots of people involved. And importantly, lots of independent evaluations, right? So we don't want everyone in a group because then we just get, conformity pressure and so forth. We want independent judgments from lots of different people, lots of different perspectives. I also think that we talked a little earlier about how, your background influences how you see things, right? And something that one hiring manager might not notice and might be very salient to another hiring manager. And so we want to have people from lots of different backgrounds and lots of different identities with their eyes on the process so that we can make it as fair and equitable as possible. And then I also think from a candidate perspective, having diversity in, who the interviewers are, who the recruiters are, who's making those decisions can also make candidates feel more included, right? So there's a lot of research showing that candidates want to see people like them in the organization, right? They want to see evidence that people like them will be promoted and that they're valued within the organization, right? So I think there are lots of reasons why we want to have diversity in terms of who's in charge of hiring or who's involved in the hiring process.
Perfect. And Lori checks in with a great question. Lori, thank you so much for this. So Lori asks, besides being aware of your bias, what are some other best practices in the hiring process to reduce bias, i.e. like using specific questions, for example? And we kind of touched on this a little bit, having a specific set of questions in the interview process.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I think that the way I like to think about it is that I ultimately don't have a lot of control over my unconscious biases. So what I want to do is set up a system that's external to me that's going to catch me, right? So, I am not going to rely on myself to be like Superwoman and never be biased. So instead, I don't want to even allow myself to go down that path, right? So I want to do things that are going to help me, right? I want to evaluate resumes jointly, not separately, right? So this doesn't assume that I can prevent myself from assuming something about someone, but I'm setting up the actual structure of the system in front of me in a way that's going to help me reduce that bias, right? Or I'm not going to assume I'm going to be the most objective interviewer, but I can set up a structured system that even if I go in tired, I'm overwhelmed, that system is going to help me, right? It's going to guide me in a way that's going to help me be objective. So I think that we want to think about also, obviously, reflecting on our own biases, being cognizant of them if we can, but also not assuming that's enough, right? And looking to external systems and organizations to sort of catch us and guide us down a more deliberative path.
And I just thought about this now, but can group interviews be effective? So instead of having, the classic, one person interviewing another, maybe, 2 or 3 people from different parts of the organization interviewing one person, can group interviews be effective?
Yeah, great question. So my view based on the research is that generally we want to avoid group interviews where all the interviewers are together in a room. This is because there's a lot of research showing that peer pressure effects can really reduce objectivity in decision making when you have a bunch of interviewers all together in a group. So think about this. So, I'm an interviewer, my boss is right beside me, my other boss is right beside me, we're all evaluating this candidate. What am I doing? I'm worried about what my boss thinks of me, and I'm trying to have an opinion consistent with my boss's opinion, right? Yeah. So I'm not an independent judge. I'm not being objective. I'm just trying to be consistent with the higher ups in my organization, right? So for that reason, I tend to sort of say that group interviews are not useful. You want to have, however, multiple independent interviewers. So you want to have multiple people interviewing the candidates, but you want to have them do that separately. Right? And what that gives you is multiple independent judgments, right? Where everyone's coming to their own independent conclusion about the person without the influence of like peer pressure or just like, anchoring on someone else's opinion, like the first person to speak after the interview and say, oh, that person was great. You're like, oh, maybe they were great, right? Well, before you're able to really think for yourself, right? So multiple interviewers, good. Having all the interviewers in one room in the interview, I would say not as good as having each person do a separate interview and then sort of aggregating the judgments or the evaluations after.
Perfect. Separate people doing separate interviews. Great. And real quick, we have one last question in from our audience. So Heather asks, can those diversity-based employee referrals lead to, actually, Lori already asked that question. Patrick, I apologize. Thank you, Patrick, for your question. So Patrick checks in really quickly. He says, can you speak to any data that might show any growth in diverse, equitable hiring as a result of remote work becoming more common? So this idea of, working remotely and equity and diversity and all that.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I have been reading a lot of things that suggest that yes, remote work is great for reaching diversity goals because it gives us access to so many more people that wouldn't, for geographic reasons or their personal circumstance, be able to work at the company or an organization, right? So I think remote work is wonderful. It's a very, very useful tool that organizations are becoming more comfortable with. That is helping organizations reach their diversity and inclusion goals, right? Because then you're going to access someone who really needs to be at home because they're a caregiver. You're going to access someone who might live across the country, but is a great person to work at your company, right? It's great for diversity. It's great for inclusion. But I do think also once we incorporate remote work, we got to think about how to have DEI strategies that incorporate those remote workers effectively too. So overall, though, I think it's great.
And what should organizations think about when they're trying to set up these goals of, hiring and not having bias when they're hiring?
Yeah, so I think that you want to think about what's reasonable, what's achievable, and how much time and money you have to devote to these things, right? So I think that, I can list 100 different tips of things you can do to reduce bias in your organization or in hiring in your organization. But you want to think about what's realistic, right? And you also want to collect data to understand, are these strategies that I'm spending time and money on actually having impact, right? And you want to invest in strategies that have that impact. And you want to think realistically, I think, because obviously in a perfect world, we'd implement every strategy, but we don't really always have the time or the resources.
Awesome. Well, Devon, thank you so much for joining us. Audience, thank you so much for your responses and your questions and everything. So my last question, if you could kind of reach out to our audience and give them, one piece of advice or one thing to think about as they, get ready for their weekend and, have this idea of, bias on their mind when they're hiring, what's that one thing you would want them to walk away with?
Great question. So I think that my main takeaway is that we're all well-intentioned. I think most of us are. We want to make good decisions. We want to make accurate and fair decisions. But, we get tired. We're overworked. We're overloaded sometimes. And so sometimes we need to just really slow down, admit that to ourselves that, the human mind is imperfect, and try to really be deliberative, go slow, collect data about applicants. To try to make better decisions, right? Because it's not only about fairness, but it's also about accuracy. And so there's lots of different reasons to care about this, but slowing down, really taking the process seriously can be really useful, and it's a great first step.
Perfect. Slowing down. Audience, thank you again so much. Devon, thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us. Have a great afternoon. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you at the next keynote. Have a great evening.